Poštovani gledatelji teme dana, dobro vam večer. Večeras razgovaramo sa britanskom sociologinjom Ursulom Huws. Profesorica Huws stručnjakinja je za pitanje rada i globalizacije. Naša večerašnja tema su socijalni konflikti koji su nastali zbog trenutačne ekonomske i financijske krize u svijetu i u Europi. Good evening, Professor Huws. Are banks the only ones to blame for current economic and financial crisis?
I don't think we can say that, because banks are very much connected with other forms of capital, like productive capital. But it seems to me that the crisis of 2007 in the banks was paralleled by another crisis, more or less at the same time, in what we might call the real economy, in companies actually producing real goods and real services.
How that crisis was visible?
Well, it was during the early 2000s, there was a huge rise globally in the number of mergers and acquisitions between companies. So there was a huge concentration of capital going on. And in the year 2006, there were more mergers than ever in history before. It was a global peak. And the top global companies increased their market share by an extraordinary 20% in 1 year. They increased the number of employees by 20%. They increased their profits. But their real production did not increase. They were not investing in building new factories. The money was simply going for big companies to gobble up little companies. And so it was absolutely clear that this was an accident waiting to happen, because they need to expand. If they're not producing anything new, at some point, everything's going to go out of control. It's going to explode. So these companies were desperately looking for a new field to develop new products and services on which they could make a profit.
Did it happen?
It did. Well, it started to happen, and the new field that these new products come from is public services. The kind of stuff of the welfare states of Western Europe and North America, and to some extent other parts of the world too. We have to remember that in the OECD countries, on average, 46% of GDP is made up of public services. That's a huge number of jobs. It's a huge amount of services. It includes education, it includes health, it includes local government administration, tax collection, police, a vast range of services that up until quite recently were simply delivered as services directly to consumers without anybody making a profit from them at all.
And corporations saw that as opportunity.
Absolutely. It's a huge opportunity. And we have seen in the last 15 years or so a new breed of multinational company growing up. This is not my word, this is UNCTAD, who calls them a new breed of multinational. And instead of making cars or steel or hard physical goods, these are companies that provide services. And they started off providing services to private companies, things like IT services, data entry, human resources services, payroll management, call centers, etc., etc. But because these business services, thanks to information technology, have become more and more standardized, the same kinds of services exist in the public sector and in the private sector. So these companies that already have experience of providing, let's say, IT services to manufacturing companies, to retail companies, etc., they think, oh, well, let's sell them to the state as well. And so there's been this enormous growth in outsourcing of state services to private companies.
Can you name one of those multinational companies?
Oh, yes, there are very many. Very large companies. Siemens Business Services is one. Accenture, Capita, Capgemini, Ernst & Young, Serco, Group 4 security. There are very, very many of these companies which provide both to the public and to the private sectors. They are probably growing faster than any other companies in the history of capitalism, and they're global. They are supplying not just to European governments and the United States government, also to the government of Vietnam, the government of China. They are truly global companies.
Can we say that such corporations are the most influential organizations in the world right now?
Well, it's very difficult to think how they can be controlled and managed, because 100 years ago, if they were operating within a single country, there would have been antitrust laws that stopped monopolies developing, like in the United States. For instance, big companies like Carnegie and Mellon were broken up at the end of the 19th century because they were becoming monopolies. But these are monopolies on a global scale, and so there are no institutions really to control them. The United States is the world's dominant economy, and we could say United States kind of orchestrates the global economy, but it doesn't control it. And these companies, many of them don't pay tax in the countries in which they operate, because they have parent companies located in tax havens, like in the Bahamas, in Liechtenstein, in Jersey, wherever. And they have complicated structures. And at the top level, the fact that you can't really slide a credit card between what is financial companies and what is manufacturing companies. They are merged because they operate like financial companies at the global level. But on the ground, they are delivering services in every country. They have a workforce in every country. But they are beyond the control of the nation state. The nation state can't even tax them, let alone control them in other ways.
Can we say that such corporations are essentially antisocial?
Well, it's difficult to see them in any other way. Their motivation is to make profit. And one of the things that I've been doing in my research for the last few years is actually looking at what happens, talking to workers who used to be public sector workers, who are then transferred to work for these private companies. And one of the things that they find the most difficult is that instead of most people, they go and work in the public sector because they're motivated to help people. They become a teacher because they want to work with small children. They become a nurse because they want to help people get well, etc. They have a real motivation to work in the public sector. And many of them actually made a decision in their careers to accept less money in return for a public sector job, because they thought the work-life balance was better, the job satisfaction was better, and so on. Then suddenly, overnight, they find themselves working for a private company, and they are told, you have to meet these targets, you have to work faster, we have to make sure we make a profit out of this job, you mustn't spend too long with the patient, because that will cost too much money, and, if you've met your quota, you stop. There is a clinic near where I live in London that has a contract to see 175 patients a day for the local hospital. Quite recently, they saw their 175 patients, and then number 176 came along, and he had acute appendicitis. But they couldn't treat him. They were told they couldn't treat him. They had to send him in a taxi to another hospital, to a public hospital. And for workers who are used to doing these caring jobs, it's very hard to find yourself working in this commercial environment where the only thing that matters is meeting your targets.
Could you say that trend is happening in the last 15 years?
Well, I think several things came together. One thing, obviously, was the impact of information and communication technologies, which made it possible for very many tasks to become much more standardized and for them to be monitored. As soon as a job can be standardized, you don't have to have the manager with the worker watching that they are working. You just have to count the results. So you can pay them by results. As soon as a worker can be paid by results, the job can be done anywhere. It can be done in another country, it can be done by another company, it can be outsourced because it's only managed through these contracts service contracts. And so there was a kind of, if you like, a fragmentation of work associated with standardization taking place in a lot of different industries. But there was also, if you like, a political push to create what you might call a global reserve army of labour to provide this work much more cheaply. So, for instance, you have the World Bank and the European Union paying to establish courses in what they call, the EU calls the near neighbour countries, including Croatia, I guess, and in countries like India and Africa, to provide IT skills for the workforce, and to teach English, and to generally give the skills to work in a global culture to these countries where, of course, the labour costs are much, much cheaper than Europe and the United States. So that made it possible for the jobs to be sent to other parts of the world, and that had a disciplinary effect on workers in the United States and Europe who were used to quite a privileged treatment, and suddenly they had to compete with workers in India, workers in Mexico, workers in Eastern Europe, and so on.
Which areas would you say are the most interesting for the outsourcing?
Well, if you look at the companies, if you look at their annual reports, for one thing, they show extraordinary growth. Even in 2007, 2008, when the crisis was at its worst, this sector was booming. And the more the governments introduce austerity measures to try and control public costs, the more incentive there is to outsource more services, of course, to make them cheaper. So for these companies, the financial crisis, it was like Christmas, you know. Lots and lots of opportunities came from. So you can see this growth in their market, dramatic growth in the public sector markets. But the sectors that they themselves identify as having the biggest potential for growth are